You might find what's going on back here disrespectful, but I'm kind of making a point, even though it jars with the seriousness of this video. I said previously that it's not worth really me talking about Vegas, because there's nothing I can say that someone else won't have already said. And there's nothing that anyone's gonna do. You know, if Sandy Hook didn't change the American attitude towards guns, then nothing will. Not this, not anything. I hope I'm being too cynical and negative and not putting enough faith in the American people, if you will, but I sincerely doubt it. Now, this is a singular, particular incident, and lots of arguments around gun control and so on will be sidetracked and sidelined by saying, oh well, that wouldn't have stopped this one. But events like this, it's not necessarily about the event itself so much as the opportunity that these events present to talk about the whole general background radiation of gun-related shit that goes on in the States. And no other first world country has this issue to the scale that the US does. But it's not just the guns. It's a cultural thing. There are other countries with comparable levels of firearm ownership, albeit different kinds of firearms. You know, hunting rifles and so on might be more common. Shotguns and so on might be more common. Whereas the US seems to have a lot more people who own self-defense guns, you know, assault weapons, whatever that category happens to mean, and I know people will argue over that. So there's a difference in culture. There's a difference in the kinds of weapons. And a lot of that cultural issue comes down to a lot of other cultural issues that the Americas have. You know, they're a first world wealthy nation with an attitude and a view of itself that is still kind of Wild Westy. You know, the idea that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and every man and woman is a strong, independent person who should take care of themselves and all that. It's at odds with modern America's place in the world, in the same way that Britain's view of itself as this grand, great, imperial, meaningful power is at odds with its place in the world as a small, declining country on the fringes of Europe. You know, this is a problem that both countries have, but in different ways. Gun control does work. Yeah. Criminals will always manage to get guns, but the point of gun control is it makes it more difficult, and that merely having a gun marks someone as worthy of examination and suspicion and consideration, and it starts to choke the supply. And the last time we had a really major influx of weapons in the UK was when the IRA downed tools, basically, and a lot of their weapons came from the US, ironically. So, you know, it does work, it does reduce rates, but you're not going to do that. It doesn't matter that the Constitution is talking about militia, it talks about regulation, not about individual gun ownership. It doesn't matter that the National Guard fulfills the role of a militia. It doesn't even matter to you, it seems, that your founding fathers, with a great deal of foresight, saw the need for the Constitution to evolve and develop over time, and so there are mechanisms for doing so. That doesn't seem to matter to you, except when you're banning booze, which turned out to be a bad idea, but is not comparable to guns. I just can't see it happening that the US will bring in any kind of sane level of gun control. There might be some watered down, finicky measure at some point, but that's going to be about it. People will hunker down and wait for things to be over. And it doesn't matter that the majority of the American public on all sides of the political spectrum believe that there should be, you know, more controls, better background checks, all of that. That doesn't seem to matter. The gun companies have you in their pockets far more than things like medical companies, which people have seemed to be far more willing to challenge. So it's just not going to happen. So we're going to have to look elsewhere for ways to deal with it. So why don't these other countries have this same kind of issue. Canada has high gun ownership, but less population density, more socialized care in many ways. In many ways, it's more like a European country, so it may be a cultural thing there, that there's more sense of community, that everyone's in this together, less rugged individualism, less look out for yourself kind of thing that seems to encourage this sort of behavior. But that doesn't seem like something you can change. Changing a culture takes a long time, and it's consensual. It takes generations. So that's not going to solve anything in any immediate or even medium term. That's a long term something that might be able to change, but I don't see it happening. Other nations with high levels of gun ownership, I mean, Scandinavian nations often have high levels of gun ownership due to a strong hunting culture and a strong self-defense culture, particularly places like Finland that have felt under constant threat by the Russians and did them a huge amount of damage during the Winter War. So they have a similar strong independent tradition, but they have communalism in the same way that perhaps Canada does, that a lot of the Scandinavian nations do. They have a very strong sense of community and mutual respect. It's anti-individualistic, if you will, but they see themselves as a whole. And even so, you still got Anders Breivik. There's always going to be psychopaths and individuals. But still, if we look at these countries, and we look at the gun ownership and the context in which it exists, it's more of a hunting culture, which is similar to what exists in Canada. But America's so big, some areas have a hunting culture, some areas don't. But what they do have that perhaps America doesn't is that they have a culture in which lots of people do national service, where you have to undergo training, where the guns, while they're available, are very strictly regulated in the way in which they're stored and so on, and in which it's people's duty to defend their country. And this is why, in some ways, they open guns. This is back to the old militia thing. They do have well-regulated militias, citizen soldiers, people who've done national service and who are there ready to be called up, because these are small countries, in the case of some grand invasion or upheaval of some kind. And you don't get that in the States. And it's a big country, it doesn't need that. It has the largest professional military in the world, and its militias are the National Guard. It doesn't need that. And I'm no fan of national service. That's a very conservative viewpoint that people gain somehow from being forced to be disciplined and trained in military ways. I wouldn't want to force that on anybody, and I doubt a lot of Americans would want to go along with that anyway. But it does seem to work in the context of these Scandinavian territories, that it creates that sense of community and sense of duty and gives people familiarity and respect for guns, which is maybe missing. An idea that I've put forward in the past is the idea of gun insurance. If you regulate weapons, well regulated, in the way that you do vehicles, with licensing, age restrictions, this kind of thing, qualify at different levels, perhaps. In the same way that, say in this country, you have different licenses for motorcycles, cars, heavy goods vehicles. Maybe you could have different degrees of license for a gun, and you could have mandatory gun insurance. And so when an incident like this occurs, the insurance money that you've paid is then used to pay people's medical bills, damages, funeral expenses, all that kind of thing. And this would make gun ownership a lot more expensive, a lot more elective, and provide for compensation, payment, help offset the cost of the medicine, the police and security service bills, and so on. That would be a good way to tackle it, I think. But I think people would see that as unreasonable. I don't think it would be. I mean, you have a a right to association, a right to travel, and so on, that is being restricted in its own way by restrictions and licensing and so on vehicles. So why not guns? And if you're saying that guns have these other uses, hunting, target shooting, stuff like that, you don't need these kind of weapons for that. And if you're talking about needing them to protect you from each other and from an oppressive government and so on, why doesn't the rest of the world need that? Why is it that there were successful revolutions in Eastern Europe without individual gun ownership? During the fall of communism, there was a genuinely heavily tooled up oppressive state, and people overthrew it without the need for weapons, just through popularity and mass movement. It wasn't needed. And our other nations aren't oppressive. The rest of the first world doesn't have this problem. Sure, you get scare stories from Fox News and InfoWars about CCTV and people being called away for rude tweets or whatever, but these are incredibly rare situations, and they usually turn out for the good in the end, because people generally aren't insane, and we live in democracies, at least for the time being, which are at least slightly responsible and responsive to their people. So I don't know what you can do. You have a cultural problem, you have a gun problem. There's things that other countries have done that can tackle or reduce this, and it doesn't have to be gun control. There's other ways of going about it. Insurance, training, licensing. But you and I both know you're just not going to do it. The will isn't there, the money is against you, and there's too many people that see it as an inviolable right, that they have an individual right to own guns, rather than a collective right and a duty to the protection of their neighbours as well as themselves. And if that hasn't changed already, given America is now a wealthy first world nation, then it's unlikely to change in the foreseeable future. I wish I had something better to offer, but maybe start with fixing the culture. Zang.
Get down! Stop!
I need to take a video. No. You're good. Fucking face my side. Everybody is down. Everybody's down.
Let's go!
Babe, you're okay. I promise.
I'm leaving.
We can't go yet. So we can't go yet.
Austin!